The billionaire sold me her late father's broken clock for $10. 8 weeks later, she was sitting across from me reading a letter hidden inside it, realizing her father had spent 30 years trying to get that clock into my hands instead of hers. That's the part nobody believes. They think the letter was meant for his daughter. They think the hidden compartment was a coincidence. They think I got lucky at an estate auction. I thought that too, until I found the second letter, the one addressed to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about the letter, I need to tell you about the clock. And before I tell you about the clock, I need to tell you about the day a billionaire decided to sell her father's most important possession for less than the cost of dinner. The ending of this story changed everything. Before we get there, take a quick second to join the community by hitting subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 43 years old, and I restore antique clocks for a living. Or at least I try to. Some months the business does all right. Most months it doesn't. The month I bought Walter Ashford's clock happened to be one of the difficult ones. That matters later. I attended the Ashford estate auction hoping to find something I could restore and sell. Nothing glamorous, just enough to keep the lights on for another month. Maybe enough to cover a few bills that had started sitting on my kitchen table longer than I liked. I'd been to dozens of estate auctions over the years. Most of them feel the same. People walking through somebody else's life after they've left it behind. Buying pieces of it one item at a time. A lamp, a chair, a watch, a photograph. Here's the thing. Death has a way of turning even the biggest life into a collection of objects. The Ashford estate sat on the river outside Savannah. Massive place, iron gates, long driveway, more windows than I could count. The kind of house people slow down to look at when they drive past. Walter Ashford had built one of the largest companies in the Southeast. Everybody knew his name. The newspapers called him a visionary. The business channels called him a legend. By the time I arrived, most of the guests seemed more interested in the prestige of being there than the actual auction. Expensive suits, designer dresses, watches worth more than my truck. I spent most of my time staying out of the way. That's usually the safest place for people like me. Eventually, I noticed Victoria Ashford moving through the rooms with a group of lawyers and auction staff. I'd seen her picture before. Everybody had. She looked exactly the same in person, sharp, controlled, difficult to read. People would point toward one of her father's belongings and ask whether she wanted to keep it. Most of the time, she barely looked. No. Sell it. Donate it. Get rid of it. Just like that. Fast decisions, no hesitation. At least not on the surface. I remember watching her from across the room and thinking she looked exhausted in a way sleep probably couldn't fix. I didn't know it then, but that observation would end up meaning more than I realized. The auction moved from room to room, and eventually I found myself wandering into a quieter section of the house. That's where I saw the clock. It stood in the corner beneath a tall window. Dusty, silent, ignored. Nobody was paying attention to it. I almost walked past. Then I noticed the carvings. I stopped, turned around, walked back. Now, I've spent more than 20 years restoring clocks. Long enough to know quality when I see it. Long enough to know when something was built by a craftsman instead of a factory. The clock was old, very old. The finish had faded. The pendulum hung crooked. The face was cracked, but underneath all that wear, I could see something special. More importantly, I could see signs of repair. Not one repair, several. Somebody had spent decades keeping that clock alive. People don't do that unless they care. I was studying one of the side panels when I heard a voice behind me. You know that thing's probably worthless. I turned and saw Victoria standing there. A few guests nearby stopped talking and listened. I smiled. Maybe. She looked at the clock. My father refused to get rid of it. There was something in the way she said father. Not anger exactly, something heavier, something older. It's beautiful work, I said. She gave a short laugh. "You're the first person who's said that today." A few people around us smiled. Then she looked at me and said, "Tell you what, you can have it for $10. The guests laughed, not because it was funny, because they thought I understood it was a joke. I looked at the clock. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and handed it to her. The laughter died surprisingly fast. Victoria stared at the bill, then at me. For a second she looked genuinely confused, like she wasn't used to people taking her seriously when she wasn't trying to be. Finally, she took the money. "Well," she said, "I guess it's yours." An hour later, I was loading the clock into the back of my truck while workers carried away furniture worth more than everything I owned. The sun was starting to sink over the river. The estate behind me buzzed with conversations and closing bids. I secured the clock carefully and stepped back to make sure it wouldn't move during the drive home. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, metal shifting against wood. I froze, listened. There it was again, small, muted, coming from somewhere deep inside the clock. Not a loose pendulum, not a damaged gear, something else. I rested my hand against the old wooden case and waited. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then I heard it one more time, a tiny movement hidden somewhere inside, and standing there in the fading light, staring at a clock I'd just bought for $10, I got the strange feeling that Walter Ashford wasn't quite finished with it yet. By the time I got home, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. My apartment sat above the workshop, nothing fancy, just 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen that always felt too crowded, and a living room that seemed to collect unfinished projects the way other homes collected decorations. I parked behind the building and stared at the grandfather clock sitting in the truck bed for a moment. $10. The thing looked like it weighed 300 pounds. I still wasn't sure whether I'd made a smart purchase or a stupid one. Before I could figure that out, the front door flew open. Emma came running down the stairs. "Dad!" She stopped when she saw the clock. Then she forgot about me completely. Now, if you're a parent, you know that feeling. When your kid sees something that instantly captures their imagination, you can actually watch it happen. She walked slowly toward the truck, her eyes locked on the clock. "What is that?" "A grandfather clock." "I know it's a clock," she rolled her eyes. "I mean, where did it come from?" I laughed. That was Emma, 9 years old and already correcting me. "It came from an estate auction." She moved closer, carefully, like she was approaching a wild animal. "It's beautiful." I looked at the cracked face, the faded wood, the crooked pendulum. Beautiful wasn't exactly the word I would have used, but I didn't argue. Kids see things differently, sometimes better. She spent the next few minutes running her fingers across the carvings while I unloaded tools from the truck. Most people at that auction had walked right past the clock. Emma noticed every detail. That matters later. Eventually, we carried a few groceries upstairs and settled into our usual evening routine, or at least we tried to. The stack of envelopes waiting on the kitchen table made that difficult. Bills, hospital statements, insurance notices, more paperwork than actual money. I sat down and started sorting through them while Emma worked on homework nearby. Here's the thing. You can ignore a bill for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, but eventually it starts feeling like another person living in the house, always there, always waiting. I opened one envelope, then another, then another. None of them contained good news. They rarely did. Across the table, Emma pretended not to notice. Kids are funny that way. They notice everything. They just don't always say anything. Business hadn't been great either. The previous month, I'd restored exactly 2 clocks. The month before that wasn't much better. People are willing to spend money on a lot of things. Old clocks usually aren't near the top of the list. I remember looking at the numbers I'd written in my notebook and wondering how many more slow months I could survive. Not forever. That much was obvious. A few minutes later, Emma closed her workbook and looked toward the window. The grandfather clock was still sitting downstairs in the workshop, waiting. Who owned it before us? The question came out of nowhere, or at least it seemed that way. Walter Ashford. The billionaire? That's the one. She thought about that. Then she asked something I wasn't expecting. Did he love it? I looked up. What do you mean? The clock. She shrugged. Did he love it? I thought about the repairs I'd seen inside the case, the years of maintenance, the effort somebody had gone through to keep it running. Yeah, I said finally. I think he probably did. Emma nodded, like that answer made perfect sense. Then she asked another question, one I still remember word for word. What happens when the people who love things disappear? I sat there for a second. Not because I didn't hear her, because I didn't immediately know how to answer. Finally, I said, sometimes somebody else takes care of them. She seemed satisfied with that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. You always say old objects have stories. I do. Then maybe this one isn't finished yet. I laughed softly. Maybe. No, really. She pointed toward the workshop downstairs. Maybe it's waiting to tell the rest. I remember looking at her and thinking how much she sounded like her mother sometimes. Same curiosity, same certainty about things nobody else could see. After she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a while. The bills were still there. The business problems were still there. Nothing had changed, except the way I was looking at the clock. Originally, I'd planned to clean it up and sell it, maybe make a quick profit, maybe pay off one or two overdue statements. That would have been the practical decision, the smart decision. But sitting there in the quiet apartment, I kept thinking about the repairs, the craftsmanship, the strange sound I'd heard inside it, and something Emma had said. Maybe it's waiting to tell the rest. I don't know why those words stuck with me, but they did. Finally, I stood up, looked down toward the dark workshop below, and made a decision. I wasn't going to sell the clock, not yet. First, I was going to find out why somebody had spent decades trying so hard to keep it alive. The next morning, after Emma left for school, I carried the grandfather clock into the workshop and started taking it apart. That's usually how I learn about an object. Not by looking at it, by opening it. Anybody can see the outside. The real story is usually hidden underneath. The clock had been repaired a lot over the years. I noticed that almost immediately. Different screws, different wood patches, different replacement parts installed decades apart. Some repairs were professional, some clearly weren't. But every single one told me the same thing. Somebody had refused to give up on this clock. I spent most of the morning carefully removing panels and cleaning old mechanisms. The deeper I got, the more personal the clock started to feel. That probably sounds strange, but when you work on old things long enough, you begin recognizing the people behind them, the choices they make, the habits they leave behind, the things they cared about. Around noon, I found a set of initials carved into the inside of the case. W.A. Small enough that most people would never notice. I almost missed them myself. Walter Ashford. Not engraved by a manufacturer, added later, by hand. I stared at those initials longer than I probably should have. Here's the thing. People don't usually sign things they don't care about, especially not where nobody else will ever see it. For the first time, I started wondering why that clock mattered so much to him. A couple hours later, the bell above the workshop door rang. I looked up and saw Victoria Ashford standing there. She glanced around the shop before her eyes landed on the clock. You're actually working on it? I smiled. I told you I would. She walked closer and looked at the disassembled parts spread across my workbench. For a moment, I thought she might be curious. Instead, she shook her head. I still can't believe I kept that thing as long as I did. I didn't say anything. She crossed her arms. My father treated that clock like it was some priceless treasure. It seems important to him. It shouldn't have been. The answer came fast, almost rehearsed. Victoria looked at the pieces on the table and let out a short laugh. You know, I almost threw it away after he died. Something about the way she said it stuck with me. Not because she sounded proud, because she sounded tired, like she'd been carrying the same argument for years. Then she shrugged. Honestly, selling it was probably the better option. A few minutes later, she left as suddenly as she'd arrived. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. The workshop felt strangely quiet afterward. I went back to work. The more I thought about the conversation, the less it made sense. Walter had clearly cared about the clock. Victoria clearly didn't. And somewhere between those two facts was a story I didn't understand yet. Late that afternoon, while examining one of the interior panels, I noticed something unusual. A seam. Tiny, almost invisible. I leaned closer, then ran my finger along the wood. It wasn't part of the original construction. Somebody had altered it. Carefully. Deliberately. My pulse picked up a little. I grabbed a flashlight and inspected the surrounding frame. The hidden seam continued farther than it should have, far enough to suggest a compartment. Not a repair, not damage. A compartment. I sat back and stared at it. The strange sound I'd heard inside the clock suddenly came back to me. The shifting noise, the metallic movement, all of it. I didn't know what was hidden inside. Maybe nothing, maybe something. But for the first time since buying the clock, a thought entered my mind that I couldn't shake. What if this wasn't just an old clock? What if somebody wanted it to be found? The next day I went back to the workshop determined to figure out whether that hidden seam was actually what I thought it was. I've restored clocks for more than 20 years, long enough to know when something is original, long enough to know when somebody has altered a piece for a reason. The compartment wasn't part of the original design, that much I was sure of. The problem was getting to it. I spent most of the morning carefully reassembling parts of the mechanism I'd already cleaned and repaired. The clock wasn't ready yet, but it was close. Closer than it had probably been in years. By late afternoon, I installed the final gear and stepped back. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I gave the pendulum a gentle push. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the workshop, steady, confident, alive. I don't mind admitting I smiled. There's something satisfying about bringing an old clock back to life. Not because of the money, because for a moment it feels like you've given time itself another chance. I stood there listening. Then the clock struck its first chime. A deep, rich sound echoed through the room. And immediately something clicked inside the case. Not metaphorically, literally. A sharp, mechanical click. I froze. The sound came from behind the panel I'd been studying. For a second, I just stared at it. Then I set my tools down and walked closer. The panel had shifted, only slightly, but enough. Enough to reveal a narrow gap that hadn't been there before. My heart started beating faster. I carefully slid my fingers into the opening and pulled. The hidden section opened like a small drawer. Whoever designed it knew exactly what they were doing. Inside was a bundle wrapped in yellowed cloth. Nothing else. Just that. I carried it to the workbench and unfolded it carefully. The first thing I saw was an envelope. Old, sealed, handwritten. The second thing was a small brass key attached with a piece of string. Not a modern key, an old one. The kind made for a lock nobody uses anymore. I turned it over in my hand. No markings, no explanation, just a key. The envelope was stranger. The handwriting looked deliberate, careful, the kind of handwriting people had before everything became emails and text messages. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Part of me felt like I shouldn't. Part of me knew I was going to anyway. Inside were only a few pages, not a journal, not a long confession, just several handwritten sheets folded together. I began reading. The letter was clearly written by Walter Ashford. That became obvious almost immediately. The tone felt personal, direct, like he wasn't writing to the public, or to lawyers, or to shareholders. He was writing to one person. The problem was I couldn't tell who that person was supposed to be. The pages contained fragments of thoughts, regrets, references to choices he'd made, references to mistakes. But nothing fully explained, nothing complete. Every answer seemed connected to a question I didn't know yet. I kept turning pages, hoping the next paragraph would make everything clear. It didn't. Then I reached the final page, and that's when I found the sentence that stopped me cold. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't long. Just one line written at the bottom. A line that made less sense the more I looked at it. It said, "If you're reading this, then the right person finally found it." I read it again, then again. The right person. Not my daughter, not an employee, not Victoria. The right person. I looked down at the brass key sitting beside the letter, then back at the final sentence. And for the first time since buying that clock, I stopped wondering what Walter Ashford had hidden. I started wondering who he had hidden it for. I called Victoria that afternoon. To be honest, I wasn't sure she'd answer. The last time we'd spoken, she'd made it pretty clear what she thought of the clock. But she picked up on the second ring. "I found something," I said. There was a pause. "What kind of something?" "A letter." The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. Then she said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She arrived in 15. I was standing beside the workbench when she walked into the workshop. The letter sat exactly where I'd left it, the brass key beside it. Victoria saw both immediately. For a second she didn't move. Then she walked straight toward the table. "That's it?" I nodded. "That's it." She stared at the envelope, the handwriting, the paper, everything. I expected curiosity, maybe even excitement. Instead, something hardened in her face. A look I'd seen before, just not this clearly. She folded her arms. "Of course." I frowned. "Of course what?" "My father." She let out a short laugh that didn't sound like laughter. "One last message, one last lesson, one last attempt to control everything." I looked at the envelope, then back at her. "You haven't even read it." "I don't need to." The answer came instantly, like she'd already had the argument 100 times. Maybe she had. Victoria started pacing slowly around the workshop. "He always did this." "Did what?" "Made everything complicated." She pointed toward the letter. "Nothing could ever just be simple with him." I stayed quiet. Sometimes people aren't really talking to you. They're talking to somebody who isn't there anymore. And that's what this felt like. Years of unfinished conversations finally finding somewhere to go. She kept going, about missed birthdays, missed holidays, business trips, board meetings, phone calls that never came. Each memory seemed to unlock another one, and another, and another. The strange thing was that none of it sounded rehearsed. It sounded carried, like she'd been dragging those memories around for years. Finally, she stopped. The workshop went quiet. The letter remained untouched, still sealed, still waiting. I looked at it, then at her. "Maybe you're right." Victoria blinked. "What?" "Maybe the letter won't change anything." She didn't respond. "But don't you at least want to know?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What if it's another excuse?" I shrugged. "What if it isn't?" That landed differently, I could tell. Not because she agreed, because she suddenly looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from holding on to something for too long. For a moment I thought she might pick up the letter. Instead, she stepped back. "No." Just one word, firm, final. No. Then she grabbed her purse. I spent my entire life waiting for him to explain himself. Her voice was quieter now. I don't need another letter. A few seconds later, she was gone. The workshop door closed behind her, and that was that. Or so I thought. A little later, Emma came downstairs carrying her sketchbook. She noticed the envelope immediately. Kids notice everything, remember that. She looked toward the door. Did she leave? Yeah. Emma sat on a stool beside the workbench. For a minute, she studied the letter without touching it. Then she asked, "She didn't read it?" No. That seemed to surprise her. Why not? I thought about my answer. Honestly, I wasn't sure. Finally, I said, maybe she doesn't want to. Emma considered that. Then she looked back at the envelope and asked a question that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. Dad? Yeah? Why are some people more loyal to being hurt than finding out the truth? I didn't have an answer, not then. And staring at Walter Ashford's unopened letter, I couldn't stop wondering whether Victoria had one either. For the next couple of days, I couldn't stop thinking about Walter Ashford's final sentence. Not the letter itself, not the key. That sentence. If you're reading this, then the right person finally found it. I must have read those words 50 times, maybe more. Here's the thing. Most people don't choose their words carefully when they're writing a note. Walter clearly did. He could have written, "If Victoria is reading this," or "If my daughter finds this," or even, "If someone finds this." But he didn't. He wrote the right person. That bothered me, because it sounded intentional, like the identity of the reader mattered more than the discovery itself. The more I thought about it, the less I could let it go. So I started asking questions. Nothing dramatic, just conversations, phone calls, coffee meetings, the kind of quiet digging ordinary people do when something doesn't sit right with them. Walter Ashford had been famous enough that finding information wasn't difficult. Finding useful information was another story. Most articles said the same things. Successful businessman, industry leader, philanthropist. None of it explained the clock. None of it explained the letter. And none of it explained why he seemed to care who found it. Then I started speaking with people who had actually worked for him, former employees, retired managers, people who knew Walter before he became a headline. That's where things got interesting. One man told me Walter used to visit factory floors without warning, not for publicity, not for photographs, just to talk. Another remembered Walter attending the funeral of a maintenance worker most executives would have never known by name. A woman who worked in accounting for 20 years told me Walter quietly paid medical expenses for employees when insurance wasn't enough. None of those stories sounded like the man Victoria described. That doesn't mean she was wrong. It just meant there was more to the story. I want you to remember that. Because people are rarely only one thing, especially parents. One afternoon I met a retired supervisor named Frank. He'd worked for Walter for nearly 3 decades. We sat in a diner outside Savannah talking over coffee. At one point I mentioned the clock. Frank immediately smiled. That sounds like Walter. What does? The clock. I frowned. Frank stirred his coffee. Walter believed objects mattered. I didn't understand. He noticed. Then he said something I'll never forget. He used to say people leave messages behind without realizing it. I sat there quietly. Frank continued. He believed objects carried those messages. I looked at him. What kind of messages? Lessons, memories, regrets, love. The answer sounded strange, but somehow it also sounded exactly like the man who would hide a letter inside a clock. Frank shrugged. He always said the right object could connect people who never even met. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I thought about the letter, the key, the clock, and Walter's final sentence. The right person, not any person, the right person. Driving home that evening, one question kept circling through my mind. Not what Walter had hidden, not what the letter meant. Something else, something bigger. What if Walter never intended the clock to reach his daughter? What if he'd spent years making sure it would eventually find someone specific? And if that was true, the question wasn't what was hidden inside the clock. The question was who it had been waiting for all along. A few days later, Emma was sitting in the workshop doing what she always did when she got bored: drawing. I'd given her a small desk near the window years earlier. Most afternoons, she sat there with colored pencils, sketchbooks, and enough imagination to fill the entire building. That day, she was drawing the grandfather clock. I was at my workbench reviewing notes from my conversations about Walter Ashford when I heard her say my name. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "What's this?" I barely looked up. What's?" She pointed toward her sketchbook. "This little symbol." That got my attention. I walked over and looked at the drawing. Emma had copied a tiny mark carved into the side of the clock, small enough that I'd never noticed it before. And that bothered me immediately, because I'd spent hours studying every inch of that clock. Yet somehow my 9-year-old daughter had spotted something I missed. Kids do that sometimes. They look where adults stop looking. I grabbed a flashlight and examined the section she'd drawn. Sure enough, there it was. A small carved symbol hidden among the decorative woodwork. Not damage, not random, intentional. I stared at it for several seconds, then something clicked. I'd seen it before, just not recently. The mark looked familiar because it was an old maker's mark, the kind craftsmen used generations ago. I suddenly became very interested. That matters later. The next morning, after dropping Emma off at school, I headed downtown to the city archives. If you've never been inside one, imagine a building filled with people who know where history is hiding. And thankfully, some of them enjoy helping. A woman working there helped me track down records connected to antique clockmakers in the region. The process took hours. Most leads went nowhere. Then, finally, we found a match. The symbol belonged to a restoration workshop that operated decades earlier. I leaned closer when I saw the records, because one detail immediately stood out. The grandfather clock had been restored before, officially documented. Not once, but at least one major restoration appeared in the records, and according to the date, it happened years ago. Long before Walter Ashford became famous, long before Ashford Industries became a household name. I kept reading, then my stomach tightened. The restoration date looked familiar, very familiar. I pulled out my phone and checked something. The years matched, almost exactly. The clock had been restored shortly after my father was working in the same trade. I sat there staring at the documents. My father had spent his life repairing clocks. So had I. That's how I learned the craft, watching him, listening to him, making mistakes while he pretended not to notice. I hadn't expected him to appear anywhere in Walter Ashford's story, not even indirectly. Yet suddenly the timeline placed them in the same world, the same profession, the same era. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. I didn't know. But for the first time, this mystery stopped feeling like somebody else's family story. It started feeling strangely connected to my own. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the clock, the letter, the key, Walter Ashford, my father. One connection by itself doesn't mean much, but connections have a habit of leading to other connections. And for the first time since finding the hidden compartment, I had a feeling this story wasn't just leading me toward Walter's past. It might be leading me toward my father's, too. A few days after the archive visit, I woke up to a sound no parent ever wants to hear. Emma was struggling to breathe. I was in her room before I was fully awake. She was sitting upright in bed, trying to catch her breath. Her face looked pale. Too pale. "Dad," that was all she managed to say. Everything after that happened fast. I've learned something about emergencies over the years. Your body moves before your mind catches up. 1 minute you're asleep, The next you're throwing on clothes, grabbing car keys, and trying not to let your child see the fear on your face. 20 minutes later, we were in the emergency room. Doctors took her back almost immediately. I sat alone in the waiting area, watching people move through hallways I knew far better than I ever wanted to. Hospitals have a smell, a sound, too. Once you've spent enough time in them, neither ever really leaves you. Eventually, a doctor came out to speak with me. His expression told me enough before he said a word. Emma's condition wasn't improving the way they'd hoped. There were concerns, more tests, more monitoring, more waiting. Always waiting. I thanked him and walked into her room. Then I pulled a chair beside her bed and stayed there. Hours passed. Machines beeped quietly. Nurses came and went. Outside the window, daylight disappeared. Inside that room, time seemed to stop. Here's the thing. When you've already lost someone you love, every hospital feels haunted. Not by ghosts, by memories. Sitting beside Emma brought me right back to the final weeks of my wife's life. The same chairs, the same hallways, the same helpless feeling of watching people you love fight battles you can't fight for them. I kept looking at Emma's hand resting on the blanket. Small, fragile, far too much like her mother's. At some point I lowered my head into my hands. I don't know how long I sat like that. Long enough to stop paying attention to the clock. Long enough to forget everything else. The letter, the key, Walter Ashford. All of it disappeared. There was only Emma, and the possibility that I could lose another person I couldn't imagine living without. Then I heard the room door open. I assumed it was a nurse. It wasn't. When I looked up, Victoria was standing there. For a second, I genuinely thought I was imagining her. She looked completely out of place. Business clothes, perfect hair, hospital visitor badge clipped to her jacket. Neither of us spoke right away. Then she quietly asked, "How is she?" I shook my head. That was the only answer I had. Victoria pulled a chair over and sat down. No speech, no advice, no attempt to fix anything. She simply stayed. Hours passed. She ordered coffee when I forgot to eat. She talked to nurses when I stopped hearing questions. And sometime around 2 in the morning, I realized she still hadn't left. That matters later. Just before sunrise, Emma finally fell into a deeper sleep. The room felt calmer. Not safe, just calmer. Victoria stood beside the window for a long moment before turning toward me. Then she surprised me. "I'll read the letter." I stared at her. What changed? She looked over at Emma, then back at me. And for the first time since we'd met, her answer didn't sound angry. It sounded tired. Life's too short to keep ignoring things. A few minutes later, she left. And as the hospital room grew quiet again, I found myself wondering whether the letter was finally about to answer questions, or create even bigger ones. 2 days later, Emma was stable enough for the doctors to let her come home. Not fully recovered, not out of danger, but home. And after spending that much time in a hospital room, home feels like a luxury. That evening, after Emma fell asleep on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, Victoria showed up at the workshop. She wasn't dressed like a CEO, no business jacket, no assistants, no carefully controlled expression. Just Victoria. For the first time since we'd met, she looked like someone carrying a weight instead of someone hiding one. The letter was exactly where I'd left it, on the workbench, beside the brass key. Neither of us spoke much at first. She walked over, picked up the envelope, and stared at it for several seconds. Then she sat down, and finally opened it. I stayed across the room, not because I wasn't curious, because some things are private, even when they're discovered by accident. The workshop stayed quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Victoria read slowly. One page, then another, then another. A few minutes passed before she spoke. "He's not apologizing." I looked up. "What?" She held one of the pages in her hand. "That's the strange part." I walked closer. She looked confused, not angry, confused. He admits he made mistakes. Her eyes moved back to the letter. But he never tries to excuse them. That caught my attention. Most people writing a final letter spend half their time defending themselves. Apparently Walter hadn't. Victoria kept reading. Every so often she'd stop, go back, read a paragraph again. The farther she got, the quieter she became. Eventually she reached the final page. Then she lowered the letter and stared at the workbench. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally I asked, "What did he say?" She looked up. "He said I never knew the whole story." The answer hung in the room. Simple, heavy, complicated, all at the same time. Victoria turned one of the pages toward me. I didn't read the entire thing, just enough. Walter acknowledged years of distance, years of mistakes, years of choices he regretted. But he never once asked for forgiveness. That mattered. Instead, he kept repeating something else, that there were things Victoria didn't know, things he couldn't explain in that letter alone. Which immediately created a new problem, because if this letter wasn't the explanation, then what was? Victoria seemed to be asking herself the same question. She flipped through the pages again, searching, looking for something she'd missed. Then she stopped. Her eyes landed on a single paragraph near the bottom. I saw her posture change instantly. "What is it?" She looked toward the brass key, then back at the letter. "The key." I walked over. "What about it?" She swallowed. "He mentions it." Now I was paying very close attention. Victoria read the line again, slowly, as if hearing it for the first time. Walter wrote that the letter was only part of the truth. The rest had been hidden elsewhere, protected, waiting, and according to him, the brass key was supposed to help someone find it. Not immediately. Eventually. I stared at the key. The same key I'd been carrying around for days without understanding. Suddenly it felt different, more important, more deliberate. Like it wasn't attached to the letter, like the letter had been attached to it. Victoria sat quietly for a while after that. The anger I'd seen every other time seemed different now, less certain, less solid. She looked back down at the pages. Then she said something that surprised me. "I don't think he was trying to defend himself." I waited. "He was trying to tell me something." There was a huge difference between those two things. And for the first time since the clock opened, Victoria seemed to understand it. The problem was that whatever Walter had been trying to tell her wasn't in the letter. Not completely. The real answer was still somewhere else. Hidden. Waiting. And now both of us were staring at the same brass key, wondering what door it had been trying to open all these years. After Victoria read the letter, neither of us could stop thinking about the brass key. The letter had answered almost nothing. If anything, it had created more questions. And the biggest one was still sitting on my workbench, a small brass key attached to a mystery that seemed to grow larger every day. Over the next week, I dug deeper into Walter Ashford's history than I ever intended to. What started as curiosity had become something else. I needed to know why he wrote about the right person, because the more I learned about Walter, the less that sentence felt accidental. One afternoon, I found myself going through a collection of archived business records stored at the local historical society. Most of it was routine: property transactions, business filings, old permits, the kind of paperwork nobody reads unless they're looking for something specific. Hours passed without finding anything useful. Then I saw a familiar last name: Cole. I froze. At first, I assumed it had to be somebody else. Cole isn't exactly a rare name. But then I saw the full entry: Thomas Cole, my father. For a second, I honestly thought I'd read it wrong. I leaned closer and read it again. Same name, same address, same time period. My father. I sat there staring at the page. The document referenced restoration work completed for Walter Ashford nearly 30 years earlier. I felt my stomach tighten. My father had spent most of his life repairing clocks, watches, and antique mechanisms. I'd grown up in his workshop. I'd learned the trade standing beside him. Yet somehow I'd never once heard Walter Ashford's name. Not once. That didn't make sense. The more I read, the stranger it became. The records suggested Walter personally requested my father for a restoration project. Not a company, not a workshop. My father, specifically. I copied every document I could find and drove straight to Ruth's bookstore. If something doesn't make sense, Ruth is usually the first person I talk to. She listened quietly while I explained everything. Then she asked the obvious question. "Did your father ever mention Walter Ashford?" "No." "Not even once?" I shook my head. That was the problem. If this had been a simple business transaction, maybe forgetting made sense. But Walter had apparently sought him out directly. That felt different. Ruth sat back in her chair. Maybe it wasn't important. I wanted to believe that, but I didn't. Because by then, too many strange connections were piling up. Walter's clock, Walter's letter, the brass key, the phrase, "the right person," and now my father appearing in records nobody knew existed. It felt less like coincidence and more like pieces of a puzzle, pieces I couldn't see yet. That night I went home and dug through several old boxes I'd kept after my father's death. Photographs, receipts, workshop notes, anything. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, I just knew I was looking. Hours passed. Nothing. No mention of Walter. No mention of Ashford Industries. No mention of the restoration project. It was as if that entire connection had been erased, which somehow made it more important, not less. I sat alone in the workshop long after Emma went to sleep. The grandfather clock ticked steadily nearby, the same clock that had started all of this. I looked at the brass key, then at the letter, then back at the records. And for the first time, a possibility entered my mind that I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What if finding the clock wasn't an accident? What if Walter Ashford didn't just want someone to find it? What if he wanted me to find it? The thought should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it felt disturbingly possible. And if that was true, then whatever I was uncovering wasn't just part of Walter's story anymore. Somehow, it had become part of mine, too. 3 days after I found my father's name in Walter Ashford's records, Victoria called me. I could hear something different in her voice immediately. Not excitement, determination. "I think I know what the key opens." 20 minutes later, we were standing outside a locked door on the 3rd floor of the Ashford estate. According to Victoria, it was Walter's private study. A room nobody had entered since the day he died. Not family, not lawyers, nobody. The brass key looked almost too small to matter. Yet somehow both of us were staring at it. Because by then we'd learned something important. Walter didn't seem to do anything without a reason. Victoria took a slow breath, then handed me the key. "You do it." I looked at her. "You sure?" She nodded. I slid the key into the lock. For a second, nothing happened. Then I felt the mechanism turn. The door opened. And just like that, we stepped into a room that had been frozen in time for years. The air felt different inside. Still. Undisturbed. A thin layer of dust covered most surfaces. Books lined the walls. A large desk sat near the window. Photographs filled shelves and cabinets. It didn't look like the office of a billionaire. It looked like the office of a father. Victoria walked in slowly, almost cautiously, like she wasn't sure what she was about to find. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply looked. The room was full of pieces of Walter Ashford most people never saw. Handwritten notes, old calendars, family photographs, greeting cards, letters, small personal items that would have meant nothing to strangers. Everything meant something to Victoria. I watched her pick up a photograph, then another, then another. Pictures from birthdays, vacations, school events. Many of them included her. Some included her mother. Others showed moments she clearly didn't remember. At one point, she sat down quietly and stared at a picture for nearly a full minute. The image she'd carried of her father for years was beginning to crack. I could see it happening. Not because of one big revelation, because of dozens of small ones, the kind that are harder to ignore. Here's the thing. It's easy to hate the version of someone you've created in your head. It's harder when evidence starts showing you a different person. While Victoria continued looking through family items, I focused on the desk. Most of the drawers contained ordinary things: business notes, personal reminders, old correspondence. Then I found something unexpected. A file box, neatly organized, labeled by year. At first, I thought it contained company records. It didn't. The files contained articles, newspaper clippings, trade magazines, restoration publications. My pulse quickened immediately, because I recognized some of them. They featured antique restoration projects, clock restoration competitions, industry interviews, and several of them mentioned me. I pulled one folder out, then another, then another. My name appeared repeatedly, years apart, different publications, different projects, different stages of my career. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Walter Ashford had been following my work, not recently, for years. Long before I ever bought his clock, long before I found the letter, long before any of this started. Victoria. My voice sounded strange even to me. She looked up. What is it? I handed her one of the articles, then another, then another. Her expression changed with every page. What is this? I have no idea. But that wasn't entirely true. The hidden compartment behind the bookshelf contained only a single envelope. By that point, neither Victoria nor I were surprised by hidden compartments anymore. Walter Ashford seemed to have spent years leaving pieces of himself behind. What surprised us was the name written on the front. Mine. Not Victoria's, not a lawyer's, not a business partner's. Nathan Cole. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then I opened it. Inside was a longer letter than the first one, and almost immediately Walter started talking about my father, Thomas Cole. The moment I saw his name, I felt something shift inside me. According to Walter, he'd met my father more than 30 years earlier, long before he became the man everyone knew. Back then, he owned an antique clock inherited from his grandfather. Several experts told him it couldn't be restored. My father disagreed. Walter wrote that my father spent months bringing it back to life, not because the job paid well, because he understood what the clock meant. That sounded exactly like him. My father never cared much about money when something mattered to somebody. Walter described him as one of the most honest men he'd ever known, a man who respected history and believed objects carried stories. Reading those words felt strange. My memories of my father had faded over the years, yet somehow Walter described him in a way that felt completely familiar. Then the letter became even more surprising. Walter admitted that after my father's death, he quietly followed what happened to our family. Not closely, just enough to know how we were doing. He followed my apprenticeship, my first workshop, my restoration projects, the articles, the successes, the failures, everything. Victoria looked up when I read that part aloud. "Why would he do that?" she asked. The answer came a page later. Walter wrote that my father once told him something he'd never forgotten. The right object always finds the right hands. Not immediately, eventually. Walter spent years believing that idea, years planning around it. And according to the letter, the grandfather clock had never ended up at the auction by accident. He arranged for it. He knew Victoria would eventually sell it. He knew most buyers would ignore it. And somehow he believed I would recognize its value. The clock wasn't lost. It was waiting. Waiting for me. Suddenly, every coincidence looked different. The auction, the clock, the letter, the key. None of it was random. Before the letter ended, Walter revealed one final thing. Neither letter contained the whole truth. One final message remained, one final answer, and finding it would require following a clue hidden among his personal records. That clue consumed the next week of our lives. Victoria and I spent days going through journals, notes, documents, and records Walter had left behind. Piece by piece, a different version of the man began emerging, especially for Victoria. The father she'd spent years blaming no longer matched the man we were discovering. The problem was deciding what to do with the truth. Walter wasn't just a father. He was a public figure, a businessman, a local legend, and changing the story people believed about him wouldn't be easy. One evening, Victoria called me. "I've made a decision." Her voice sounded different, certain. "What kind of decision?" "I'm telling the truth." I knew exactly what she meant. Ashford Industries was preparing for its annual gala. Investors, executives, reporters, and city leaders would all be there. The board hated the idea. Several members openly opposed her. Some argued the past should stay buried. Others worried about damaging Walter's reputation. Most were simply afraid of bad publicity. Victoria ignored all of them. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed more concerned with honesty than appearances. The night of the gala, the ballroom was packed. I stood near the back, feeling completely out of place. Victoria stepped onto the stage looking exactly like the CEO everyone expected. Then she started talking. At first, she discussed the company, its history, its future. The audience relaxed. Then she began talking about her father. Not the public version, the real one. She spoke about the letters, the journals, the mistakes he'd admitted, and the quiet acts of kindness nobody ever knew about. Factory workers he'd helped, families whose medical bills he'd paid, scholarships he'd funded anonymously. The room went completely silent. Then came the moment nobody expected. Victoria admitted she'd spent years believing the wrong story about her father, years carrying anger she now wished she'd questioned sooner. That kind of honesty takes courage, especially in front of an entire city. When she finished, nobody clapped right away. People weren't shocked by what Walter had done. They were shocked by who he'd really been. And standing there listening, I realized something. Walter's greatest legacy had never been hidden inside the clock. The clock had simply been the thing that finally allowed the truth to be heard. A few days after the gala, Victoria and I returned to Walter's study. By then, most of the big questions seemed answered. The clock, the letters, my father, Walter's hidden plans. Yet neither of us felt finished. Walter had spent years leaving clues behind. We had learned enough to know there was usually a reason. While sorting through journals, Victoria suddenly stopped turning pages. Then she carefully removed an envelope hidden between two entries. My pulse immediately picked up. Another letter. This one wasn't addressed to me, it was addressed to Victoria. She sat down slowly and opened it. I gave her space. Some conversations belong to families, even when one side is gone. The room stayed quiet for several minutes. The farther she read, the more her expression changed. Eventually, she looked up. "He finally told me." Those 4 words seemed to carry years behind them. According to the letter, the event that destroyed their relationship happened decades earlier. For most of her life, Victoria believed her father had chosen business over family during one of the most important moments of her life. That belief became the foundation for everything that followed: the distance, the resentment, the anger. But Walter revealed something she'd never known. The choice hadn't been between business and family. It had been between protecting his daughter from pain and protecting another family from destruction. Neither option was good. Someone was going to suffer either way. Walter chose to carry the blame himself. And because explaining the truth would have exposed people who trusted him, he stayed silent. For decades. Victoria spent years judging a decision she never fully understood, and Walter spent years accepting that judgment. The letter didn't pretend he was perfect. He admitted mistakes, failures, moments he wished he could take back. But the thing she hated him most for wasn't true. Not the way she'd believed. As she kept reading, old memories began falling into place. Conversations that never made sense. Arguments she'd misunderstood. Moments she now saw differently. One by one, the foundations of her anger disappeared. By the time she reached the last page, she wasn't reading anymore. She was remembering, rebuilding. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she carefully folded the letter and held it against her chest. Her father was still gone. Nothing could change that. But for the first time in years, the argument between them was over. And for the first time since I'd met her, Victoria looked lighter. The months that followed changed all of us. Emma's health improved slowly but steadily. Every doctor's visit seemed a little better than the last. More energy, better reports, a little more strength. The kind of progress that doesn't look dramatic until you realize how far you've come. Soon she was spending afternoons in the workshop again, filling sketchbooks and asking questions the way she always had. The place finally felt alive. Around the same time, Victoria launched the Walter Ashford Foundation. Most people expected it to focus on business leadership. Instead, it honored ordinary craftsmen, clock restorers, woodworkers, mechanics, tradespeople, the people who preserve history while rarely receiving recognition for it. The foundation also helped families dealing with serious medical challenges. That part meant a lot to Emma, and to me. My workshop changed too. The story spread farther than any of us expected. People became interested in restoration work. New customers arrived every week. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about surviving the next month. I was busy planning for the future. Victoria gradually became part of our daily lives. No big announcement, no dramatic moment. It happened naturally. One day she was visiting occasionally. The next she was joining us for dinner, helping Emma with projects and becoming someone we depended on. Emma formed a bond with her faster than either of us expected. The two of them spent hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes laughing, sometimes looking through old photographs from Walter's study. Watching them together often reminded me how strange life can be. The grandfather clock still stands in our home today, not in the workshop, in the living room, fully restored, running perfectly. Visitors always ask about it. Most expect a story about antiques or hidden compartments. They're usually surprised by my answer, because the clock was never really the point. For a long time I thought this story was about an object. Then I thought it was about a mystery. Then I thought it was about Walter Ashford. I was wrong every time. The story was about people finding each other. A father trying to leave behind the truth. A daughter trying to understand him. A little girl who noticed what everyone else missed. And a clock restorer who happened to be standing in the right place when everything finally came together. Sometimes late at night I still sit and listen to the clock ticking. The same steady sound that started all of this. And every now and then I think about Walter's final sentence. If you're reading this, then the right person finally found it. For years I thought he meant the clock. Now I know he meant something much bigger. The clock was simply the path. The real purpose was making sure the right people found each other before it was too late. And somehow they did.